Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Uxtsuki. We are almost ending the static pixel art and I wanted to talk about some beginner stuff that I didn't talk throughout this playlist. Maybe it is a good thing to talk about because some people might feel this is not complete. I'm really trying to transmit everything that I learned so far. The first thing is Jaggies. I know that you probably heard about this, but it's actually how inconsistent some curves may look like. Because if we do something like this, just because these lines are jagged, they feels a bit wrong. To be honest, some people say that you should avoid at all costs Jaggies, but it's not that way. It's just because Jaggies looks bad in things that could have a more clean shape and actually does not. For example, if you are making a tree, if you have some generic silhouette like this, if I add, for example, a lump right here, this is a lump. This does not need to follow this perfect round corner. Or, for example, if we have a sphere that is not in a side view, that is not in a diagonal view, we have something like this. Isometric lines is not in that angle. So maybe if you are doing something like foreshortening, that is the concept that the closer something is in a camera, bigger it would looks like, and further something it is from the camera, smaller it gets. Just break this idea that we do not need Jaggies, because you would need Jaggies in order to make this something appear like closer to me, because this is further, so there is not a very smooth way to do it, because actually the line would need to be a bit broken. There is also the concept of doubles, that is when you're making lines, some pixels stick to the side of the other pixel. So actually a line is not a single pixel. In this case it is a double pixel line, and in order to avoid this, you would get rid of where there is two pixels next to each other in the lines. These two concepts also affects in the symmetry of curves, because if you're making a circle, for example, you need to make sure that half of the line is the same thing as the other half. They are kind of mirrored. So this is the point, like the middle, and these have like 1, 1, and 2, 2, and the same amount of pixels wide each part of this line. So this is important because if you are trying to make a curve and it needs to be smooth, you need to make everything feels mirrored. Another thing, if you're making some curves and something like this, in order to avoid Jaggies, you need this mirroring, right? But sometimes this will have a lot of curves, so actually it's half mirrored then half mirrored again, and sometimes you are not able to make this consistent. For example, maybe in some part of the curve we have this plateau in here that could be read as Jaggies, but actually this is the plain part of that curve. So that's why it is more conditional than people think. Okay, making curves and circles or same circles and so on, it is aesthetically pleasing to see that smooth curve, but not every single time you're gonna do this, because you may face things that it does not work like this. Sometimes, for example, if I have this sort of curve, for example, and I am in a perspective of like 3/4 of a circle. So actually this curve would be something like this. I don't know. So the curves that would be perceived in here actually is kind of hidden by the perspective, you know? I need to imply this, but to imply this, I would need to be a little bit jagged, and this is the point. All right, now about bending. Bending is the effect of when two colors follows the extreme or the counter of the other color. Instead of being read as a gradient or even a cluster or a detail, they actually being read just bandings of colors being placed over the others. And how can we get rid of this feeling? Well, first is the perspective, then we have the light rules and how they need to follow the surface of each material. So everything that we learned so far, but there is a really good point that sometimes you are gonna make some bending. So how to get rid of this usually is either get rid of that color or breaking clusters. So for example, if I have this face right here and the light is coming like from here, all right? So this part is actually in shadow, like this part. I try to make a grading here, but they are bending. How to get rid of this feeling? As I said, breaking the cluster or getting rid of that other color. So maybe you do not need this smoothness of things being in shadow, or either you break the cluster. So for example, I have this following, right? Maybe I try to break this, or either I break the whole thing. So now I know I got rid of a lot of information, but I avoided this of bending by breaking cluster. This is way more clustered, but that bending effect, that fake gradient that jump out into our eyes and it is uncomfortable was broken. So ideally, as I said, you should compress your bends. But if this is not possible, break the cluster with the same color. Dithering is a painting technique to fake color transitions and color ranges by making them blend. Alright? So for example, if I have this gray and this gray, for example, if I use dithering, zoom out and squint your eyes, like close your eyes, doesn't feel like this is one, this is other one, and this is other one. So this is the effect of dithering, and the dithering can be any shape. Usually further you are from the color transition, less and less dithering you would need to apply. So maybe only some lost pixels like this and some lost pixels like this. You are able to make this dithering. But to be honest, I don't like dithering because this feels way too old. Since dithering use a lot of clusters and orphan pixels, these necessarily make the images more noisy, alright? And I don't like pixel art that are noisy. It's just a personal taste. So if you don't care about this, just go with the dithering. But I dislike and I avoid using it. But as I said, this is pretty useful if you have color transitions and even if you have lack of color. So actually you can fake colors like in this middle by alternating other two pre-existent colors. Now let's go with edges. What are edges? Well, edges is when two different values of something meets. And there are basically three types of edges. We have the hard edges, we have soft edges, and we have lost edges. Hard edges is when two values are way too far from each other. So it is a very crisp value transition. We have soft edges where two values of certain colors is pretty close to each other. So now they feel like they are actually smoothing out one color. Last but not least, we have lost edges. It is when two values is too close to each other, you are not able to differentiate shapes and actually bring contrast between two things. Soft edges is good when you have to make the impression of something. It's like touching other things. They are not that much defined. You can feel they are different, but they are kind of just a bit blending with each other. Lost edges usually it is for making textures, but also it is useful when two things does not need much contrast. For example, remember that I talked about occlusion. So if you have something like this, the light is coming from above. This part down here is in the shadow, like occlusion. The ground, the floor, this is sitting up could be actually a soft edges. So you do not need a specific color to set the extreme of this subject, because now on the shadow they reads like they are the same thing, and actually this makes a really cool effect. Obviously you gotta consider bouncy lights, the lack of contrast being, for example, somewhere that is not your focal point, but ideally and usually lost edges is used for this, and also texture. So when something could be read as a detail, as something that is like a cluster in our case on pixel art, they could be done with lost edges. Now just to talk about foreground, midground, and background, I think everything is already like well known. But let's go. Usually when you have an art piece, you have these three different zones. We have the background, that is the context of our subject. Usually it is transmitted a lot of information like of the lore, of the weather, perspective. Usually you have less contrast in this part and they are not that much detailed, alright? The background usually is just to add some context into your art piece. Then we have the midground, that is where usually your main subject, your focal points are. So if you're using any type of composition, any type of anything, creating these contrasts such as numbers or shapes or color and so on, your subject will be placed usually mid-ground. Last but not least, we have the foreground, that is the same idea of the background, but actually usually the foreground is used to make you feel like you're watching, peeking that is seen from inside of it. So there are things in front of you. So you do not capture every single thing that is in the midground and the background, but you have the feeling that you are picking it. You are looking at something in like in the lens of something that is inside of it. This is a really cool trick. And usually when you go for pixel art, sometimes lack foreground. So actually that immersion that things also in the real world may stand in front of you and block some information. This feeling is solved by this foreground. The same idea of background, this should not be the focus, so it lacks contrast. Usually is a little bit blurrier than the midground and it lacks detail as well the background. Alright? So that's it. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Bye.